Hello, welcome to our Dialed In with Delta on Thursday, February 4th. We're excited to talk to you about the legislative update and all the fun things that are going on in Washington, D.C. and how they're going to affect your business moving forward. First, I'd like to start with introducing myself. I'm David Lawrence, the president of Delta Administrative Services. I want to thank our team for putting this together, specifically our marketing team. And as always, we like to have our management team on the call so that if anybody has any questions specific to HR, we're all available here for you. So with that, this is going to be a high-level overview of PPP2 loans and their forgiveness. Then we're going to talk about ERTC tax credits and the updates that they've made in the latest stimulus package. At that point, we're going to turn it over to Teddy, our safety and risk manager, and he's going to talk about COVID-19 protection. And then Teddy will turn it over to Gabrielle, and she'll talk about some of the executive orders that have come down from the new President Biden and how they're going to affect HR. And she will then turn it over to Debbie in benefits, and she will talk about how some of the executive orders will affect you for the benefits administration. So before we get started on the agenda, I just have a couple of quick things that I want to talk about that I learned this week about what's going on in Washington, D.C. in the Congress. Right now, it's what they call a reconciliation phase, and it's because of the change in leadership and all the new appointees for all the different departments. There's what they call a reconciliation phase, and in that is basically they have their budget process. In the budget process, they're going to talk about what the spending is, what the taxes are going to be, and the entitlements that everybody they are still spending on. And then basically they do a reconciliation and start with the legislative package that's coming. Obviously, everybody is aware of the new stimulus package that's trying to get through Congress, and they're negotiating on that. The two things that they talked about that's going to try pretty quick traction on. The first is the minimum wage. They're talking about the $15 minimum wage moving pretty quickly through the Congress when they get everything in place. And the second is FSA relief, which is flexible spending. Because anybody that has flexible spending accounts probably didn't do much spending and going to the doctor in 2020, they want to give some relief. And if you're familiar with flexible spending, it's kind of a use it or lose it. So they want to make sure that there's some legislation coming down to help with that package soon. So again, I'm going to start with the PPP loans, and we're going to go over a high level. As I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because there's a lot to go through. What I need you to know is this is being recorded, and both the slides and the recording will be on our website either later today or early tomorrow. So PPP. The first thing you need to know is that the SBA is moving slow, kind of on purpose, and they're not giving a lot of new information out. But let's talk about the eligibility to apply for the second round of PPP. If you have not gone and drawn the first time, it's been expanded to include new groups that are 501c6s and destination management organizations who are required to, these are more lobbying groups, 501c6s. The second draw, here are some of the eligibility requirements. Same business entity types as last time: self-employed, sole proprietors, independent contractors, for-profit businesses, 501c3 and 501c19. 300 employees or less, which is down from the previous, last time it was 500 employees or less, has experienced a 25% decrease in revenue during any quarter in 2020 compared to the same quarter in 2019, or a 25% decrease in 2020 compared to all of 2019. And we're going to go through that a little bit further in a second. And also, you must have spent if you had the first PPP loan, you must have spent all of the money for that loan. It doesn't mean you have to apply for forgiveness yet, but you have to spend it. And the other thing, caveat I'll say to that is, if you haven't spent it yet, but you will spend it before you receive the PPP2, then that's acceptable as well. So how do you calculate a loan amount for PPP2? Basically, it's the same for all businesses except in NAICS code 72, which is hospitality and restaurants. It's the same rules as last time. It's 2.5 times payroll cost as defined below based on either 2019 or 2020 period. And then if you're in NAICS code 72, which is hospitality, you can use a multiplier of 3.5 times payroll cost as defined in either 2019 or 2020. The eligibility of what you can include in that. Payroll cost, including some employer paid benefits, any interest payments or any mortgage obligations incurred that were in place before February 15th, 2020. Payment of rent, excluding related party rents, then you can only use interest or on your loan. That has to be in place again before February 15, 2020. Utility payments, including payments for electricity, water, gas, transportation, telephone, internet access, and all of these had to be in place again before February 15, 2020. That's pretty much the rule across the board. So they did expand what's some expenses are eligible to be toward forgiveness on PPP1 and PPP2, and I'll go into that in a second as well. Payroll costs, including group paid benefits for life, disability, vision, or dental insurance. That's employer paid, that's not employee paid. So part of your payroll costs that are premiums that you're paid as the employer. Covered operation expenditure, payments for business software, cloud computing, software, HR services, PPP expenses. And one of the things that we have lobbied for as an association, it doesn't specifically say PEO service fees, but we're taking it that if it's used in a broad interpretation of you're using our software and our payroll expenses, then we think in our software, we think that it qualifies, but we're asking the Congress, or the SBA, I should say, to specifically say PEO expenses, and we will keep you updated on that. Other covered supplier costs based on contract, purchase order, or goods in effect for taken out for the loan that were essential to the business. A new thing they added was covered property damage costs because of the storms that we've had in the past year. If you had any damage that was not covered by insurance, you can use that toward your PPP reimbursement or forgiveness. Now remember, you have a 60-40, you have to have at least 60% toward payroll costs, and that others can go into that 40%. So the covered damage cost would be in that 40% range. The application requirements for PPP2 must be submitted with the same lender if you had the first one. Your documentation of payroll 2.5 times may not be necessary, but it will be necessary for forgiveness for anything over 150,000. Expenses must be, rules on spending for forgiveness. The expenses must be eligible as previously described. The business can elect an 8 to 24 week period. It should say 224. They passed in this latest stimulus bill. It can be, you can cut it off at any time between 8 and 24 to utilize the funds. And again, it must be 60% of these funds used on payroll. So an update on PPP1, the forgiveness expenses are allowed, are also deductible, which is a big deal. I also, in the second, if you look at the EIDL advance, it's no longer being deducted from your loan forgiveness. I have several friends and clients that have asked for forgiveness, and that they found out that they had to 15,000 or the 10,000 they got as the advance was taken out of the loan forgiveness. Now it's not doing that anymore. So if you waited, you're getting a bonus if you did get that EIDL advance. If you have not submitted for forgiveness on your first PPP loan, then you can include the expanded expenses as part of your loan forgiveness. So everything they passed that we just talked about can now be used for your PPP1 forgiveness. Any questions on PPP?
Questions? No questions, David.
All right, thank you. ERTC is Employee Retention Tax Credits, and this is where it gets a little bit confusing. In the new law that they passed, the stimulus, they made it eligible for payroll taxes for both 2020 looking back and 2021 moving forward for the first 2 quarters. But, or I should say not but ERTC in 2020, when they first came out with the CARES Act, was you could use PPP or ERTC. And most everybody went with PPP because it was an easier and a more expansive program. Now they've allowed it so that if people got the PPP money and ran out at the end of the 3rd quarter, but still needed extra help for tax relief in the 4th quarter, you could use any funds that are not being earmarked toward PPP loans can be used toward ERTC tax credits. So there are some stipulations on that, and I'm going to go through that with you. So here's the pre-CARES Act, and then the new changes after 12/31/20. ERTC applies with respect to qualified wages between March 12th and before January 1st, 2021. Now it has been extended for 6 months through June 30th of 2021. In 2020, ERTC had a credit for the whole year for 50% of qualified wages within any quarter, but it's totaled for the year of $10,000. 50% of $10,000 for the year. The change is for the wages paid after January 1 through June 30th, 21. The ERTC rate is increased to 70%, but not only is it 70%, it's for both quarters. So in 2020, it's maximum of 10,000 or 50% of 10,000 for the year. For 2021, it's 70% of 10,000 for each quarter, which means you can get tax relief of up to $7,000 per employee per quarter in 2021. So what happens after June 30th, 2021? Well, it goes away unless Congress extends it again. Is there an overall limit on the ERTC that an employer can claim? No, it's an employee by employee cap. The government essentially pays eligible employers up to $5,000 of qualified wages per employee in 2020 and up to so it should be 7,000. No, 14,000, correct, for both quarters of qualified wages combined in the first 2 quarters for 2021. Eligible employers. This is where it gets a little bit complicated, where in 2020 you have to have a decline of gross receipts of at least 50%. So you have to show between 2019 and 2020 you had a decline in the time period of at least 50%, or you were shuttered or closed partially for either any time in 2020 to look at the time period, but you're only eligible for those tax credits while you were limited or shut down completely. A few more frequently asked questions. What is a partial or full suspension of operations of a business? Well, I got to tell you, it's 10 pages of notes from the IRS, and it's not easy to go through, but I've listed it here in the FAQs, 28 through 38. They give extensive and complex guidance on how to make sure that you qualify for these shutdown or suspension of operations credits. So, does the employer get credit for wages during the end quarter, even if it only suspends operation for part of the quarter? The ERTC applies only to qualified wages paid during the suspension or the closure. What's included in gross receipts? Gross receipts is generally included in total sales, net of returns, and all amounts received for services. It also includes income from investments, rents, regardless of whether it's delivered or as the ordinary course of business. And there's an FAQ on that specific item as well in the IRS guidelines. So which quarters are compared to determine eligibility under the gross receipts test? If you look, and I'm not going to go through this line by line, but if you look at this, and you can get a copy of this after, but when you see the quarter to quarter, it shows you what you have to compare to be eligible for these tax credits for both 2020 and 2021. If a company meets the 50% reduced receipts test for quarter two 2020, but gross receipts rebound to more than 80% in quarter 3 when compared to quarter 3/19 with respect to which quarters is the company eligible for ERTC. The company would be an eligible employer for Q2 and Q3, but not Q4 unless gross receipts meets the 50% test again. As such, qualified wages paid during Q2 and Q3 could be considered for purposes of claiming the ERTC for Q2 and Q3. Note that the prospective repeal of the receipts rebound test, reduced receipts test, may affect this. Now, I also would throw a caveat in there. If you're using in quarter 2 or quarter 3 your PPP from the first round, anything you're using, you can't have more than one tax credit at the same time. So if you're getting a tax credit, that is the way they look at it for PPP loan forgiveness, those wages can't be used toward ERTC. So just know that whenever your ERTC dollars, you stopped reporting it toward PPP or PPP loan, that's when your ERTC money starts. And then there's, you have to make sure you're eligible. So qualified wages, there's some changes. It's for under 100 or fewer employers. I'm sorry. It's for employers with 100 or fewer full-time employees. And that goes by the Obamacare regulations on the hours to divide out to make sure that they're full-time equivalents. So what wages count? Social Security wages without regard to wage base plus qualified health plan expenses. So employees' 401k contributions count. Employer contributions to 401k, including matches, do not. Neither do the employer HSA contributions. So it's basically the items I mentioned earlier, the medical, the dental, the vision, those types of things. How does employer count full-time employees? I just touched on that. Full-time employee means full-time equivalent, and they must average at least 30 hours or 130 hours of service in a month. The employer is operated in 2019 would count the full number of full-time employees in each month in 2019 and divide by 12. Do you count part-time employees? Good question, and they haven't come out with the specific rules, but I would do it by the full-time equivalent rule that we talked about a second ago. Treasury guidance direction. The guidance is IRS directions to issue the tax forms. This is where I'm going to take a break from reading the screen. I might tell you the truth. You can apply in 2021 for what's called an advance on a 7200 form. And that's for payrolls that you've run in 2021 so far up until you can start tax credits. If you feel like you're eligible now for these ERTC tax credits, we can turn it on for you now and you can start taking those credits. Now, they also said you can file a form 7200. First of all, you have to have that 7200 in before your 941 is submitted for the first quarter. And the second thing that the IRS guidance has come out and said is the IRS will not look at your form 7200 until they've reviewed your 941. So why are they calling it advance if you have to turn in the form and they're not going to look at it until after you send in your tax form? So It's IRS guidelines. The other thing that I will share with you is that the health coverage, I'm sorry, I think I have it in a slide here. All right, oops, I'm sorry. If we have a client wanted to file for retroactive ERTC in the fourth quarter, but their tax liability does not cover the total amount of the credit, should we file a Form 7200? And that's what I was just talking about, where the IRS has not specifically addressed the point for the 7200 form for 2020 tax credits. But realistically, the 2020 tax credits are not going to be paid back anytime soon. And it's going to just take a long time because you have to do it on a form called 941X, and it's going to be by quarter for every approved amount that of employee wages that are available for this tax credit. And it's a manual written process that has to be manually done and mailed. If you know anything about the IRS, they have bundles and bundles of mails and trucks that they haven't even opened yet. So I just, I wouldn't expect, if you're eligible for this, I wouldn't expect it to come back anything soon. And I would also mention that we're waiting for future guidance on this because there's got to be an electronic format to make it easier for businesses to apply for this 2020 tax credit, because a manual process and sending it in the mail and waiting for the IRS is going to take, the IRS is already inundated. It's almost impossible to keep up with all of that. So they do have a disaster provision that I mentioned earlier that you can add to both the PPP and the ERTC. So if you have disaster problems where you have things that weren't covered by insurance, you can apply those as well to these tax credits. If you have a client wanting to file for an advance for the first quarter, I just talked about that, where IRS has stated that you must file your Form 7200 before the 941 for the quarter for the advance payment, yet they won't look at these forms till after you file the 941s. And I'll also say that they only let you fill out the Form 7200 once. If you fill it out wrong, they don't let you resubmit. So our opinion is if you're eligible, to let us know and we can turn it on the credits immediately and then ask for the additional credits on the 941 when we file for it. And that's, I'll just end with saying, if you're not confused, you haven't been paying attention. So I appreciate your listening, and I wonder if I had any questions.
No, no questions.
All right, we'll move to Teddy.
You confused everybody.
It's a very confusing, and I'll just say that please reach out to me and I'll go through it and talk you through on an individual basis. It may be a little bit easier than trying to go through it in a 10-minute presentation, because really I could spend hours on it and I've bored everybody to death. But thank you for your time, and I'll turn it over to Teddy, and he's going to talk about COVID.
Hey, thanks, Dave. I appreciate it. So yeah, today we're going to discuss the legislation impacting risk and safety, and this essentially is the executive order that President Biden signed on January 21st. Next slide, Dave. So as I stated, with the inauguration of the new U.S. president on January 6th, a slew of new executive orders followed, including one protecting worker health and safety. This was signed on the 21st. And today we're summarizing the pertinent pieces of the executive order. However, to read it in its entirety, you can always visit www.whitehouse.gov and find it there. So Section 1 says simply stating the policy of the executive order, and that is the president believes the president believes it is his and his administration's job to implement and enforce protection for the health and safety of workers concerning COVID-19. So like most Americans, the president believes that there's a moral obligation to ensure the health and safety of workers. And that's what that section states, just the policy states. So moving on to Section 2, enforcing under the OSHA Act, President President Biden is directing the Department of Labor Secretary, acting to the Assistant Department of Labor Secretary for OSHA, shall enact the below. To issue in 2 weeks revised guidance to employers on workplace safety during the COVID-19 pandemic. You may have heard something about this, as this guidance was issued last Friday, January the 29th. It covers how best for employers to protect their workers from COVID-19, and this guidance is just recommendations. It's not a standard or regulation that is required to be implemented. The best recommendation in the guidance and by Delta is to implement a COVID-19 prevention program or pandemic policy. We can assist you with this, and you can always reach out to us by contacting at DAS Safety, that's DASSAFETY at deltapeo.com. The second bullet here, consider emergency and temporary standards for COVID-19. If deemed necessary, formally issue them by March the 15th. So it's likely due to the slow rollout of the vaccine and rising number of COVID cases that these temporary standards will be formally issued and therefore enforceable. Expect these standards to include short, medium, and long-term changes to better protect employees. An example of a short-term change would be requiring masks in the workplace. Now, most of us already do this, but again, it will be enforceable should the temporary standards become formally issued, or if they formally issue them by March the 15th. On the third bullet, in relation to COVID-19, review enforcement efforts of OSHA and identify issues that can be improved to better protect workers. So OSHA officers are expected to increase by 50% to over 1,500 in the next year. Currently, there was 749 with the last administration. They expect that to grow to over 1,500 the next year. And if you couple that with the state OSHA officers, it's very possible that we'll see an increase of over 2,500 personnel nationwide enforcing health and safety regulations with an emphasis on COVID-19. It's also likely they'll be looking for low-hanging fruit, meaning implementation of a COVID-19, as I stated, a COVID-19 program, like I stated before, or pandemic policy. So again, if you don't have one or creating one or need help with it, please reach out to us. The fourth bullet, launch national program to focus OSHA enforcement efforts related to COVID-19 on violations that put largest number of workers at serious risk. So this national program will be designed to focus on industries like healthcare, emergency response, and hospitality, as they employ the largest number of workers at the greatest risk. That's not to say that they're not going to focus on other industries, but they're going to look at those first. Last bullet on this slide, for areas hit hardest by the pandemic, coordinate across the Department of Labor agencies a multilingual campaign to inform workers of their rights. And this, this will ensure adequate communication resources for COVID-19 to all employees in major metropolitan areas, as obviously those were the areas hit hardest by the pandemic. Next slide. So in section 3 of the executive order, it starts as the same as the section 2, protecting other categories of workers from COVID-19. President Biden is directing the DOL secretary, acting to the assistant DOL secretary for OSHA, shall enact below. To coordinate with states who have their own OSHA plans under Section 18 of the OSHA Act, that workers are adequately protected from COVID-19, and their plans are consistent with the guidance from Section 2 that we just went over. Additionally, for states who do not have their own plans, ensure they're working with government entities to bolster protection from COVID-19 for public sector workers. This essentially will help to ensure COVID-19 regulations implemented that is consistent across all the states. The second bullet, all administration departments, to include agriculture, transportation, and energy, continually explore mechanisms to protect workers not protected under the OSHA Act, so they remain healthy and safe on the job during the COVID-19 pandemic. This here is to assist employees whose companies do not fall under federal or state OSHA regulations. Much like if there are companies with less than 10 employees, they don't legally have to fall under OSHA regulations and do not fall under OSHA regulations. But this executive order is stating that this Section 3 will assist those companies. And the last bullet, the Department of Labor Secretary to work with Assistant Department of Labor Secretary for Mine Safety and Health Administration on all Section 2 matters and enforce as needed. And that's pretty much self-explanatory. Again, this is Section 3, essentially protecting other categories of workers from COVID-19, and that's what we covered. Joe, do you have any questions?
No, you do not have any questions. Thank you, Teddy.
All right, thanks. We're going to move to Gabby now, our HR supervisor for legislation on impact in HR.
Thank you, Teddy. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Gabrielle Rios, the HR supervisor, and I am going to be going through some new legislation. First thing we're going to be talking about is the executive order preventing and combating discrimination on the basis of gender identity or sexual orientation. So we all know about Title VII and the protected classes of race, color, religion, national origin, age, physical or mental disability, genetic information, veteran status, and sex. So sex is now going to expand farther than just male or female, but sexual orientation and gender identity are something that we need to keep in mind as well. So Title VII's prohibition on discrimination because of sex covers the discrimination on the basis of gender identity and sexual orientation. It is the policy of the new administration to prevent and combat discrimination on the basis of gender identity, sexual orientation, and fully enforce Title VII and other laws that prohibit discrimination on the basis of gender identity and sexual orientation. The next executive order we're going to be discussing really briefly is supporting the reopening and continuing operation of schools and early childhood education providers. So elementary and secondary schools are deciding whether they're going to reopen, how are they going to reopen, and how are they going to maintain the open status for in-person learning, and also safely conducting in-person trainings, learnings, including implementing mitigation measures such as cleaning, masking, proper ventilation, and testing. Higher education on safely reopening for in-person learning, which we should take into account considerations such as the institution's settings, the resources, and the population it serves, and their best practices for operating safely during the pandemic. Our next slide, we're just going to touch on a few, I guess we can say like important topics. Number one is encouraging employees to get the COVID-19 vaccination. So many employers are encouraging but not requiring employees to get the COVID-19 vaccine. Now, for those employers that can require the vaccine, they should keep in mind that a reasonable accommodation might need to be made for someone with specific religious beliefs or even just medical conditions. The next bullet point is employees who refuse work due to unsafe work conditions during the pandemic. While this is not finalized, there has been discussion of another executive order that would protect employees who can resign from their position due to quote unquote unsafe work conditions. It is said that even though these employees are voluntarily resigning their position, they will still be eligible for unemployment benefits. Now, like I said, this is nothing that has been finalized. This is just something that's kind of been discussed in the last few weeks. Our last bullet is extending FFCRA. So while the Department of Labor did not formally extend FFCRA, some employers have made the decision to go ahead and extend it for their employees, and they are still possibly eligible to receive tax credits if they have decided to extend further. That kind of wraps up the HR portion. I am going to be passing it to Debbie. I did notice that one question came in. Did you want to read that now, Jody?
Yes, if Teddy could get back on for just a moment.
Gabby,
So Teddy, we have,
Gabby, can I ask you on the FFCRA, is that just for the first quarter or for the second, or how long is that extension?
So that is going to extend through March 31st. Am I right about that, Jody?
you are correct. March 31st, 2021. We have not heard of any extension past the first quarter.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So Teddy, we have someone who is asking, should we expect OSHA to mandate masks be worn in office settings. Have you heard anything further on that topic?
Thanks, Jody. Lance, to answer your question directly, that's a great question to answer directly. And all the research I conducted for this particular webinar and temporary standards, this example was used as a short-term goal that masks shall be mandated. So again, my opinion is that yes, the temporary standards will become enforceable as of March 15th. As again, the vaccine is a slow rollout to it, that the coronavirus cases continue to rise in all states. So I think they are going to be adopted and enforced and issued by March 15th. And I would say the short-term goal is going to be masks are going to be mandated in all workplaces. Now, having said that, we don't know what it's going to look like, and it very well may say this must be in your pandemic policy, right? And as long as in your pandemic policy, you'll be fine. So how you implement that in your pandemic policy is how it would obviously affect you at your place of business.
Thanks, Teddy.
Perfect. Thank you for that, Teddy. So now we're going to move on to our final panelist, and that's going to be Debbie. So Debbie, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jody. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm getting a brief update on the Affordable Care Act that has now been reinstated. President Biden on January 28th signed an executive order reinstating the Affordable Care Act. So basically what he's doing is reopening the marketplace for a special enrollment period from February 15th to May 15th. What this means to you as an employer, there will be an additional opportunity for your part-time employees to review the plans available through the marketplace and make an election through the open enrollment period, the special enrollment period. Congress is right now considering expanding the limit for the subsidies that will be available to eligible income levels. However, those levels have excluded many Americans, and they're looking at expanding those income levels to reach more of the middle class. As David mentioned, there's still legislative pending regarding the flexible spending accounts that have been used in 2020. So the use it or lose it rule may not apply. We're still pending information on that particular issue. And as soon as we receive any further information about that, we will provide it to all of our employers and make certain that you're aware of it so we can adjust your FSA accounts accordingly. Does anyone have any additional questions for me or anyone on the panel?
Actually,
At this time,
I have a question. I'm gonna throw it to you. It's just a fastball, but have you heard of anything for Cobra subsidies that could be coming down the pike?
I have not, but considering that this administration is very interested in assisting Americans, I would not be surprised if we see something along that legislation in the future. However, we haven't seen anything to date based on the Cobra subsidies.
Thank you.
thank you, Debbie. We appreciate that. So we do have one question, and I don't know that we are able to answer it, but they're asking if we are aware if there will be another stimulus check.
That is part of the new legislation that's bogged in Congress right now, and they're negotiating. You know, it passed the House, but it's not getting through the Senate, even though it's a 50-50 now with the new the way the Senate is broken. But it takes a 60% margin, and I know that there's a Republican caucus that has, I think, 10 or 15 Republican senators that went to the White House to present a compromise earlier this week. I'm not sure where that stands. Part of that stimulus package does have a check that's supposed to be coming. And that's part of the negotiation. I think President Biden wants $1,400, if I'm not mistaken. And it's a smaller amount that the Republicans are negotiating.
Yeah, the Republicans are wanting to reduce it to $1,000 and only offering the $1,000 stimulus to people under a certain income, so not to everyone. So that is still in the works.
Yeah, and I believe the 1,400 was anybody under 75,000 income. But you know, it's still nothing has been passed to go to the president for his signature. So that is still a negotiating. That's going to take a little bit of time. If you see how long this last stimulus package took, who knows how long it's going to take. And then, you know, we're all hoping that the like Teddy was talking about, if we all get the vaccines rolling, then maybe we don't need all these new stimulus things to come down the pike. But that's, you know, I don't have a crystal ball. So there is something in the works, and we'll be able to share it when it comes out, but speculating on it is probably wasting our time, unfortunately. Anything else?
All right, well, we have no more questions. So David, if you would like to wrap us up.
Sure. I just want to thank everybody for attending. I thank for the staff. I thank Francesca for putting all this together. She did a great job of marketing it. And as always, we're here and eligible to answer any questions for any HR need or pandemic or for the PPP and the ERTC. Like I said earlier, it's kind of a personal thing. It's hard to go through in a webinar, and I'll be happy to talk you through if you're eligible, and then what the potential could be for your tax credits. So thank you for your time, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the week and weekend.
Thank you, David. Thank you, everyone.